Hello again, fellow Jeti users. In this video, we're going to look at controlling 6 flight modes with 2 switches. This has come from a particular request for somebody who is using 3 flight modes in a fairly typical way with the 3 position flaps, so that you can have separate elevator trims with them, but also wants another 3 flight modes, so it depends on the position of the retracting undercarriage. So we'd have, and we'll use the word gear because it's commonly used in place of retracting undercarriage. It's simpler. So we'd have the gear down, flaps up, gear down, flaps at takeoff, gear down, flaps landing, and then another 3 flight modes for the gear up position and the flaps in those positions. Now, in case you're thinking, oh, it's a bit unusual and we shouldn't be controlling things that way or to that extent, it may be not common, but there is a valid place for it. For example, I have an English Electric Lightning from the Mick Reeves kit, and in the Lightning, the main legs retract backwards at 60 degrees with the wing sweep. They're big wheels with a big metal hub. They've got wheel brakes on them, and they're on the end of very long legs because it's a mid-winged aircraft. And when you put the gear up or down, there is a huge change in the elevator trim, regardless of where the flap setting is, and the flaps make big changes as well. So there can certainly be times when it is valid to have a flight mode independent for the gear setting, so that you can have elevator trims going with it. We might have, for instance, a Corsair or other model that has 90-degree twist and turn retracts, maybe with heavy wheels. Or you've got some other thing that needs these 6 flight modes. How are we going to do it? Well, I've already been in and I've created an additional 5 flight modes, and I've named them gear down, flap up, gear down, flap takeoff, flap landing, gear up, flap takeoff, gear up, flap landing. And there's the default flight mode, which I've renamed gear up, flap up. Okie doke. Let's go in and assign a switch to them. And I'm going to assign this to logic switch 1, which we'll be writing in a second. And we'll assign this one to logic switch 2, which we'll be writing in a second. Okay, and this one can get L3. Okay, now you might be thinking that we carry on making logic switches for the gear up modes. We don't need to. We can simply assign these positions direct to the flap switch. So that's gear up, flaps to takeoff. So I'll put the flap switch 1 position away from the takeoff position, go in here and assign it to the takeoff position. Done. And down here I can go in, switches 1 position away from the landing position. So I go in, push the switch to the landing position, say OK to that. Now, you're maybe wondering, well, why do I need logic switches here but not here? Why can't I use those up there? And why are the logic switches up here? Okay, it does not matter what sequence we put the 3 gear downs in, as long as they're 3 together. So I could put the gear down, flaps landing up there and what have you. It does not matter what sequence I put here for the gear up, including the default. I could put them to any of them, doesn't matter. Nor does it matter that these are the gear down. They could be the gear up, and those be the gear downs. What matters is that the gear downs and the gear ups are grouped together, so like that, or that way round, and that the logic switches go to the top 3, not to the bottom 3. The reason being is that the flap switch, which is going to be involved in all of them, is always going to be in some position, so something assigned to the flap switch is always going to be on. And if we put those up here, they would take priority over the logic switch. So even if a logic switch came on, the flap switch is going to be in some position, so it would always override that. So that's why the logic switches are up top. We could, if we want, make logic switches for these, but we don't need to, because we're going to use the priority ordering of flight modes to do the work, so why bother writing logic switches for them? Okay, let's go and look at writing logic switches. So L1 is gear down and flap up, then take off and land, and they're all gear down. Okie doke. Let's come out of there, go to our logic switches. I'll not bother labeling it just to save time because we know which one is which. Enabled. So control 1, so well, this logic switch is going to be the gear down, flap up. So put my gear one position away from the down position, put my flaps one position away from the flap up position, and off we go. So control 1 will be gear down. Okay. Control 2 will be flap to the up position. Okay. And the condition for them is going to be and. Okie doke. Say OK to that. Logic switch 2 was gear down, flaps to take off. So come down here, gear to the down position. OK. Control 2 is flaps to the takeoff position. OK. Good. And come down. The condition is and. OK. And finally logic switch 3, which is again gear down. So I'll move the gear to the up position. Control gear down. OK. And control 2 is flaps to the landing position. OK. Condition is and. OK to that. That's it done. So if I go to there and wheels up, yep, lovely. Go back to fine tuning and have a look at our flight modes now. OK, now remember that if you've watched my video about managing flight modes, you can have multiple flight modes switched on. What the computer does is it starts here and runs down the list until it finds the first one with a tick, and it will use that one. All the ones below it with a tick don't get used. That's why what was the default flight mode, we've renamed gear up, flaps up, you cannot have a switch for it. It is permanently switched on. I know there isn't a tick there, but it is permanently switched on, and you cannot move it up the list, because if you did, of course, it would overwrite anything below it because it's permanently switched on. It's the backstop flight mode, so that everything else is switched off. The computer runs down the list, gets to here, finds an on, and uses that one. Okay, so what we can see here is our logic switches are off because I've got gear up. Remember, the logic switches all used gear down with an and condition. So it doesn't, with gear up, doesn't matter what I do with the flap switch, none of them can come on. So what state is it looking at now? The computer runs down here till it finds an on switch. The only one that is on is default, which is gear up, flaps up, which is indeed where I have my switches. What if I move the flaps to the landing position? Sorry, takeoff. That is the takeoff position, yes. Gear up, flaps up, switch has come on, but because the gear switch is not down, none of the logic switches are on. So the computer runs down here, sees that one is on. So that's for the one it uses, even though gear up, flaps up is also on. So we've got two flight modes are switched on, but that's the one it uses. What happens if I move the switch to the landing position for flaps? Well, now that one switches on. So computer runs down the list. There are two flight modes switched on, but that's the first one it reaches. That's the one it uses. Okay, now watch what happens when I switch the gear down. So we're going to gear down. Flaps are in the landing position. So this one here, gear down, flaps land, should switch on. Look at that. Now there are three flight modes switched on. Gear down, flaps landing, gear up, flaps landing, and gear up, flaps up. But, as I said, the computer runs down the list. What's the first one it finds? Is gear down, flaps landing. So that's the mode it's using. If I switch the gear up, watch that switches off, and the computer will change to gear up, flaps land. Oh, help if I moved the retract switch, wouldn't it? There we go. Gear up, flaps land. See, it switched off. If I move, where are we? Flaps down, flaps in the landing position. So if I move the gear down, that should switch on, and that will go to gear down, flaps land. There we go. Now, gear down, flaps landing. If I move it to the flaps takeoff position, that logic switch comes on. Again, we've still got 3 flight modes switched on. That flight mode, and that flight mode. But the computer just runs down the list and says, there's the first one, that's the one I'm using. Gear down, flaps takeoff, gear down, flaps takeoff. And if I finally move the gear down, flaps up, there we are, gear down, flaps up. So there you are, that's how you can have 6 flight modes on the 2 switches.